The Book of Esther, as found in the Hebrew Bible, is unique because it does not explicitly mention God. However, the Greek version of Esther, found in the Septuagint, LXX, contains 6 additional sections that add religious depth, prayers, and visions. These additions were later removed from most Protestant Bibles, but are still included in Catholic and Orthodox Christian traditions. While the Hebrew Esther has 10 chapters, the Greek version has 6 extra sections, usually placed at various points in the book rather than forming separate new chapters. These are labeled as additions A through F and are typically integrated into the main text in Catholic Bibles. Here's a breakdown of the added content. Addition A: Mordecai's prophetic dream and his discovery of a plot against the king. Addition B: the official royal decree against the Jews, detailing their supposed crimes. Addition C: the prayers of Mordecai and Queen Esther, asking for God's intervention. Addition D: Esther's audience with King Ahasuerus, where divine intervention makes him favor her. Addition E: the royal decree reversing the previous edict against the Jews. Addition F: the interpretation of Mordecai's dream and a conclusion that explicitly credits God with saving the Jewish people. The additions reinforce several Torah-based ideas. Divine providence. Unlike the Hebrew version, which is silent on God, the additions make it clear that the Jewish people's survival was due to God's intervention. Prayer and repentance. Mordecai and Esther pray, fasting and seeking divine help, aligning with Jewish traditions of seeking God's mercy. Justice and reversal of fate. Like many biblical stories, Joseph in Egypt, the humble are exalted, and enemies fall. Covenant loyalty. The additions emphasize that God remains faithful to Israel despite persecution. The removal of these sections primarily occurred during the Protestant Reformation, 16th century, for several reasons. Not in the Hebrew text, the Jewish canon, finalized around 90 CE, did not include the Greek additions. Since Protestants preferred the Hebrew text, they excluded the extra material. Theological differences. Some reformers felt that these additions reflected later interpretations rather than the original events. Lack of early Christian consensus. While the Catholic and Orthodox traditions kept them, some early Christian figures, like Jerome, hesitated to fully endorse them. This section serves as a prologue, introducing a prophetic dream that Mordecai has about a cosmic struggle. He sees 2 dragons ready to battle, a small nation in distress, and God intervening to bring deliverance. This dream foreshadows the conflict between Haman and the Jews. It also gives Mordecai a prophetic role, similar to biblical figures like Daniel and Joseph, who interpret divine messages. Additionally, this section includes Mordecai's discovery of a plot against King Ahasuerus, where 2 eunuchs, Gabbatha and Thera, plan to assassinate the king. Mordecai reports this, saving the king's life, an event that later leads to his rise in power. Significance. Introduces divine intervention early in the story. Positions Mordecai as a God-guided figure. Connects Esther's story with the broader biblical theme of God's deliverance of his people. This section expands on Haman's scheme by including the actual royal decree issued to justify the extermination of the Jewish people. In this decree, King Ahasuerus, influenced by Haman, accuses the Jews of being rebellious, lawless, and refusing to obey Persian customs. The decree is written in dramatic, condemning language, portraying the Jews as a dangerous group that needs to be eliminated for the good of the empire. Significance. Shows how propaganda and official laws can be used against marginalized groups. Highlights Haman's manipulation of the king. Reinforces the idea that the Jewish people are being targeted not for any wrongdoing, but because of their faith and customs, a key theme in Jewish history. This is one of the most religious additions to the book. In the Hebrew version of Esther, God is never mentioned directly, but here, Mordecai and Esther both offer prayers asking for divine intervention. Mordecai's prayer. He acknowledges Israel's sins and pleads for God's mercy. He reminds God of his covenant with Abraham, showing faith that God will not abandon his people. He asks God to change the king's heart. Esther's prayer. Esther humbles herself, acknowledging her weakness. She prays that God will grant her favor when she approaches the king. She criticizes the Persian culture of idol worship, contrasting it with the Jewish faith. Significance. Reinforces the idea of fasting and prayer as weapons of the faithful. Restores the religious element missing in the Hebrew version. Shows that Mordecai and Esther rely on God, not just their own cleverness. In the Hebrew version, Esther approaches King Ahasuerus, and he immediately extends his golden scepter to her. However, in the Greek version, her approach is far more dramatic and emotional. As she walks toward the king, she is overcome with fear and collapses. The king initially reacts in anger, but then God intervenes, softening his heart. Ahasuerus suddenly becomes tender toward Esther, rushing to comfort her and offering her whatever she wishes. Significance. Adds an element of divine intervention. God changes the king's heart. Emphasizes Esther's humanity. She is not a fearless warrior, but a woman relying on God. Highlights the danger she faces. Without God's help, she could have been killed. After Haman's downfall, the Hebrew version simply states that a new decree allows the Jews to defend themselves. However, in the Greek version, there is an official royal proclamation that explicitly condemns Haman and praises the Jews. The king declares that Haman lied about the Jewish people and manipulated him. The Jewish people are peaceful, law-abiding citizens. The previous decree is overturned, and the Jews are now allowed to defend themselves and retaliate against their enemies. Significance. Highlights how the truth is eventually revealed. Shows God's justice, the wicked are punished, and the righteous are vindicated. Reinforces the theme of divine reversal. What was meant for destruction turns into victory. The book concludes with Mordecai interpreting his prophetic dream from edition A. The two dragons symbolize Mordecai and Haman. The small nation in distress represents the Jews. God's intervention proves that the battle was not won by human strength, but by divine power. The final lines explicitly credit God for the Jews' survival, emphasizing that all of these events unfolded according to his will. Significance. Provides a spiritual conclusion, reinforcing the message that God protected his people. Connects back to the prophetic dream, creating a sense of divine order. Serves as a direct contrast to the Hebrew version, which leaves God's role unspoken. Purim commemorates the events of the Book of Esther, where the Jewish people were saved from extermination by Haman's decree. The key themes include God's hidden hand. Though God is not mentioned directly in the Book of Esther, his influence is evident throughout the story. Reversal of fate. The day set for Jewish destruction turns into their victory. Sacrificial courage. Esther risks her life to save her people, similar to how Jesus sacrifices himself for humanity. How it connects to Jesus. Just as Esther risked everything to save her people, Jesus, Yeshua, offered his life as a sacrifice to bring salvation to the world. In Esther, God's name is never mentioned, yet his influence is seen in how events unfold. In the Gospels, Jesus often speaks in parables, revealing truths in hidden ways. In both, divine intervention is at work behind the scenes, bringing salvation. Connection. Just as Esther's story shows God working behind the scenes, Jesus' mission also unfolds in a way that was hidden from many people until his resurrection. A major theme in Purim is Nahaphach, things turned upside down. Haman builds gallows for Mordecai, but Haman himself is hanged there. The Jews are sentenced to death, but instead, they defeat their enemies. In Passover, we see another great reversal. The Israelites are enslaved in Egypt, but through God's intervention, they are set free. Pharaoh believes he holds absolute power, but in reality, God's judgment brings liberation to his people. The firstborn of Egypt perish, but the blood of the Lamb spares the firstborn of Israel. Connection: both Purim and Passover celebrate an unexpected reversal where oppression is overcome, deliverance comes through divine intervention, and God's people are saved. Purim occurs in the Jewish month of Adar, February-March, about a month before Passover, Nisan 14-15. Jesus was crucified during Passover, which commemorates the Exodus, the first great salvation of the Jewish people. The pattern of divine rescue repeats. Exodus: Jews saved from Egypt. Purim: Jews saved from Persia. Passover: Jesus' resurrection brings spiritual salvation. Connection: this holiday celebrates freedom from oppression and divine deliverance, but in Passover, salvation is extended to all people through Jesus' resurrection. The word Purim comes from the Persian word pur, meaning lot, because Haman cast lots to decide the date for destroying the Jews. This act of casting lots symbolizes that fate is not random, God is in control. Interestingly, at Jesus' crucifixion, Roman soldiers cast lots, Matthew 27 verse 35, for his clothing. Both cases show that while men may think they control events, God is the one truly directing history. Connection: the casting of lots in Purim and at the cross remind us that God's will prevails over human plans. Esther mediates for her people before the king, risking her life. Jesus mediates for humanity before God, sacrificing his life. Both act as intercessors, standing between judgment and mercy. Connection: Esther's role as a deliverer foreshadows Jesus' ultimate role as the Messiah, who delivers his people from sin and death. Purim is about physical salvation, the Jews were saved from death in Persia. Passover, about spiritual salvation through Jesus, all who believe can be saved from sin and eternal separation from God. Both remind us that God is always working behind the scenes to bring deliverance, hope, and victory. Key takeaway: Purim foreshadows the themes of Passover, showing how God's deliverance, divine reversal, and salvation plan unfold throughout history. Esther saved her people for a time, but Jesus' sacrifice brought eternal salvation. The Greek additions to Esther dramatically reshape the story. They introduce God's presence and divine intervention into a book that otherwise lacks direct references to him. They emphasize the importance of prayer, fasting, and repentance in moments of crisis. They clarify that the events of Esther were not just political maneuvering, but part of God's plan to save his people. These additions were later removed from many Bibles due to their absence in the Hebrew text, but they remain valuable for understanding Esther in a more explicitly religious and Torah-centered way.